do sort of, so let me do an illustrative example here. I'll record it so that also AB gets it. So that,
Yeah.
because it's a good question. So I'll show you what we are trying to do with a hypothetical example. So let's imagine that we have, let's say, 10 papers, for example, 10, random papers.
Okay.
And I will sort of code what they have, and then I'll show you progressively what we can do. So let's say, for example, one paper, let me do it like this. So we'll call it paper title, right? Next one will be journal, and I'll name journals A, B, C, D, then C, A, B, A, C, B, and A, right? Then we will have year. I'll just have some random years, 1990, 2000, 2010, and I'll just do this, for example. And then 2020, like this. Then we have journal art, name and stuff like that. That's not important. But then we have topic, and then we have variables, right? So all of these used students, we know that, we already checked on that, right?
Yeah.
So right away, based on this, we can say that we have looked at a total of 4 journals, and we can see that, actually, I'll do it like this. And we can see that Journal A publishes a lot of papers on students, and 40% of all papers published about students were published in Journal A. But Journal D, for example, didn't publish, or published only 1 paper, only 10%. So right here, we have a nice discussion of which journals favor student papers and which ones try to stay away. Likewise, we will do analysis like this before we get into anything, and we will say that over time, also there is a difference in publications by just a second. So there is a difference over time. So it seems like the 2000s were the most popular time. So before that, nobody used students, and lately nobody really uses students. But in the 2000s, a lot of research relied on students in 90s. So that was, the time when everybody was using students. So right there, we have some information. Then we go through the topics, right? And we found that this paper studied regret, as we just looked at it. Another one started satisfaction. Another one started satisfaction. One started studied compensation.
Cross cultural behavior, something like that.
We can get to that in a second. Yes, so that would be maybe another one: political views. Another one: satisfaction, compensation, motivation.
Yeah.
So that gives us several things right here. So one, again, it gives us the topics. So we can say then, when we look at our pivot table, we can say that most of the papers that used students were focused on studying motivation. There were a few that also looked at compensation and satisfaction. There were a few that looked at compensation, and there were a few unique studies, like one studied regret. We couldn't find anything like that. And we also found some studies that looked at political views. Very unique. We didn't have anything else. Now, for the unique studies like political views or regret, that's where we basically stop. We don't need to review every single study. We have dozens of them. So we're not going to get into the details, what exactly they studied about regret. We just say, in fact, like at some point we can even, before we get into the variables, we may even add a separate category, let's call it theme. And so here it would be attitudes. Here, I think it would be also attitudes. Compensation would fall more into, I don't know, policy, for example, right? Political views, I guess, more of attitudes, policy, motivation seems to be more of attitudes, or whatever it will be. So it could be a completely different, list of themes, but we can say that students were primarily used to study, for example, attitudes, and then a couple of studies started policy. So it gives us some information. Now, so for specific topics here, regret is unique. So it's good to know and mention that there was a study that studied regret, but we can't do much with it. But then let's take a look at some of these other studies. So regret, for example, variables were, regret, and then let's call it variable 1, variable 2, variable 2, maybe it was country, right? So they basically looked at the differences by country. But so that doesn't tell us much. Satisfaction. So again, let's say, for example, they studied variable 1 was satisfaction, or let's call it, life satisfaction.
Mm.
And then let's say they also did it by, I don't know, income, maybe. So maybe they wanted to see if rich people are more happy with life, right? Another one looked at life satisfaction and income, compensation. Maybe they looked at preference for individual, or maybe for fixed salary versus hourly wage, right? So for example, and let's say they also looked by, I don't know, culture. Looked by, let's say, culture, and maybe we can add here, 5 countries, maybe they compare. So political views, they looked at Republican versus Democrat views, and then maybe, I don't know, by age, for example. Then satisfaction, these looked at job satisfaction, and they looked also at income, for example. Compensation, maybe they had the same thing, and then culture. And again, I'm hypothetical here because it will be hard to find 2 studies that studied exactly the same stuff, but close enough. Here, for example, they looked at motivation level and compensation, and I don't know, wage, motivation level and wage, and here motivation level and bullying in the team. So at this stage, we can kind of look at the topics more fine-grained. But what I'm very interested in, I'm interested in this stuff. So let me do it like this: data sort by variable or by topic. And so that's where I get very interested. So what I want to see is this. Like, for example, here we had 2 studies that studied the same thing. And so as the next step, and I'll probably do that myself, I'll record the information that they had. And so, for example, the variable that they recorded was correlation. And let's say this study found a correlation of 0.5 between motivation and compensation, and this one found 0.3, right? So what I'll do there, and let's say, we have probably over 100 papers. Let's say we had more than just 2. Let's say we had 4 studies like this, right? Or even if it were only 2. So now that's where we can really get, first we will have an average correlation level. So we'll say that for the studies that used students to study the correlation between wage and motivation, the average effect size was 0.4. So the average correlation was 0.4. So we cannot do much with this. It doesn't matter. We cannot do much with, for example, Republican Democrat, because it's only a single study. So we cannot analyze it. It's just one study. We cannot do much about regret. So it's just one single study. But we do have a lot of studies that looked at motivation versus wage. We also found a bunch of studies that looked at life satisfaction and income, and maybe one found weak effect and the other one found a strong effect. And this one found maybe with job satisfaction, let's say 0.5. So here again, I'm not sure if we can compare life satisfaction with job satisfaction, but we can definitely look for some sort of an average. It's a little bit more complicated mathematically, but we would account for the difference in the size of the sample, difference in other things, but overall they also found an effect of 0.4. Now this is interesting. So that's something where we can get into. Basically meta-analysis. So here we know that when, for example, wage and motivation was studied, the correlation was 0.4. And so what we'll do as the next step, we will then go and look at for studies that looked for that same outcome using employees. And so if I look at, for example, motivation and wage, motivation and compensation, I'll probably find a lot of studies. And in fact, I'll even look for meta-analysis. Maybe I'll even find meta-analytic studies on the topic. Intrinsic motivation and intrinsic incentive, blah, 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 blah. Oh, yeah, meta-analysis. So what I'll do is I will look for that meta-analysis. Let me see if I can quickly find something that I can open. How much high performance work practices matter, age and work-related motives, results. Okay, maybe this one. So in any case, I'll look for a study that looked at, is it not opening? Journal this is. Economic empathy training. Let me try to open that one. Well, let's say, for example, I find one study that was based, also looked at motivation and compensation, but they looked at the employees. Or maybe I even will find a meta-analytic study that looked at N equals, or in this case, K equals 100 papers. And so they did average. And so they find that the correlation here is 0.6. So what that allows me to say is that in 100 studies, or whatever number I'll find, when motivation and correlation between motivation and age were studied, they found 0.6 correlation in a sample of employees. We found that in a sample of students, the correlation is 0.4. And so the conclusion is that it does seem like there is a difference. So if you use students to study the effects of wage on motivation, you will underestimate the effect, because in our sample of studies, the effect was only 0.4, whereas in a sample of employees, it was 0.6. And maybe we'll do the same thing for life satisfaction. Again, we can find a lot of studies that looked at income and life satisfaction. So let's see, income and life satisfaction. We'll probably find, yeah, money and happiness. Can money buy happiness? And so we found this one study here, and then another study somewhere else. And then so we kind of average those effects. Let's see if they have a correlation somewhere here. So they have regressions. They probably have the correlation somewhere. But in any case, we look at all of those studies, or maybe meta-analysis, and we find that they found a relationship of 0.4. And so here we see that when they study life satisfaction and income, it doesn't really matter if these are students or if these are employees, the effect is the same. In which case, well, if you want to study, for example, satisfaction, then it doesn't really matter. You can use your student sample, the effects will be the same. But if you wanted to study, for example, I don't know, motivation at work, it seems like there is a difference. Now, going back to your original question, so what do you want me to give? So in the end, I want to know which studies measured exactly the same thing, so that I can analyze them, I can average that effect, and I can say, okay, in a sample of studies, let's say 4 or 5, maybe 10 papers for some topics, we found 10 papers that studied the same relationship, and they found this average effect size. And then next step, I'll go and I'll see if I can find the same studies that studied the same relationship, but now using employee samples. And so for some of the topics, like for example, motivation, satisfaction, compensation, we will likely find a lot of studies. For others, like for example, regret, I don't think there will be many. It's such a unique topic. I mean, who else will study regret? But we don't know at this time. And so as this first level of sort of coding, I want to get a general sense of what variables were included. So don't worry too much about getting me all the details. Just get me the general topics, the list of variables, more or less. And so once you're done, so once, let's say, for example, when you're done, you will have coded, I don't know, maybe how many papers we have there, 100, 200, 500, I don't remember.
385 for me. I think AB has like 250 or something.
Yeah. And so let's say, that's your coding. So whatever that is. And so at that stage, once I more or less know the topics, what I'll go is I'll go one more time through topic with theme, try to block it in something more manageable, like maybe 20 main topics, 30 main topics. And so that's where I'll start noticing, okay, it seems like we have quite a few papers on motivation. Let's meta-analyze this stuff. And that's where we will code all the details about that paper. How big was the sample? What specific instrument did they use? How exactly did they measure each variable? What was the correlation? What was the mean standard deviation? So that's where we will get into all of those details. And then maybe in this whole pile of 500 papers, we'll find only one paper on regret. And if so, yes, we will still mention that in our review. We'll say that we found so many papers, we coded whatever hundreds of them we coded. And so those several hundred papers, there was one, for example, like we'll give the full list of topics, and we'll probably do it like, as I said, like in this form. So we will just literally get the full list, and we will, have it like that. And so we'll say that, some topics were very popular, others maybe were mentioned only once.
Yes.
But but that's the whole point here. So that will give us, so therefore, don't spend too much time at this time in terms of getting into the very details. We will need those details only for the papers that start, like if we have a topic studied in maybe 3 papers or more together. In that case, we'll try to meta-analyze them, get the numbers, find a comparable sample of employees, studies or employee-based studies, and then do the comparisons. But for the relatively unique papers, we'll simply list that they were present. We will mention so that some researchers use students for that purpose as well, but it was only 1, maybe 2 papers. So therefore, at this stage, move relatively quickly, get me the general topics, maybe the list of the variables. Don't worry too much about getting all of those variables, like the most, the key ones, the ones that were, I mean, usually it may be easier just to list all of them if you have like a correlation table. But as long as you get me the general sort of, information about the topic and variable so that I know what was studied. The relationship between which variables or the difference among countries or people on which variables. So that would be sufficient at this stage. So we will then clean it one more time, and then maybe one more time, and then eventually we will select the blocks that we will be studying in very, very specific depth, but we don't want to waste time on every study like that. I will not be surprised, to be honest. So we'll probably end up with about maybe 30, 40, 50 maybe unique topics. But I will not be surprised that we will have, if we will have only maybe 5 topics at most that have been studied in more than 2 or 3 studies. Most of them will be probably relatively unique, unfortunately, because we want more studies of the same kind. We don't care what kind, but we want more of the same kind. But I will not be surprised if they will be very different, and only, as I said, maybe 3, 4, 5 topics at most will be represented by more or less, like different researchers studied exactly the same relationship.
Okay, so you wanted me to name the topic quite generic, and also you want it to be distinguishable.
Yes. So yes. So try to name the topic, as you said, in general terms. Like the general. But we also will have the title of the study, so that gives us some information. Plus, you copy also there the abstract. Again, if I'm not sure, I can look at the abstract, and then you have the list of the variables. And again, you see my screen here, right? Like, so for some of them, like here, so they don't. Like income rank, so they have the income. Do they have anything else here? So it seems like it's all about income in this study. So, but you remember, like we looked at the previous ones where you have a correlation table and you have a little bit more information there. So, so get all those variables. And so I will be then carefully looking at each of them and then, renaming those topics probably even a few times, because it's impossible in advance to think, to know which topics we will have. So maybe, regret, who knows, maybe regret will be a very popular topic. And maybe once we start coding, maybe there will be 10 studies that studied how regret changes over, different countries or whatever. So unlikely, but if that happens, that's fine. So, but for now, kind of get me the best sort of description you can get in terms of those general terms. And I think that should give us a pretty good idea as to which sort of common themes or which topics are more popular. And again, maybe, one of them you will name them as satisfaction. Another one, maybe you'll name it as, well-being or subjective well-being. So it's hard to come up with a, name, but once we start reading them, it seems like it's the same topic, different name. So, but that's the idea. That's the idea.
Yeah, that makes it very easy, Professor. All this while, I mean, I took a lot of time just to understand, go through the paper, and then come up with something.
You don't need at this time to understand all the details of the paper. Just get me, essentially, in the perfect world, I would like to know what kind or correlation between which 2 variables was, or several variables was studied, or difference among groups on which of the variables. But the problem is, as I said, that every time they will name those variables differently, they will name those topics differently. And so that's where the complexity will be. In the ideal world, I want everyone to use the same names, the same terminology. And so in that case, we will just copy everything and then sort it, and we are done. In reality, each author will name those things a little bit differently. And so that's why I want a little bit more information. I want the topic, I want each variable, and just in case the title of the paper, just in case the abstract, because, as I said, we will then need to standardize the labeling, and only then we will be able to sort and see which ones are more popular.
Yes.
It may even happen that, you name some variables or some topics one way, and then you see another study with the same topic, another one and another one. And then maybe you realize that 5 studies back or 10 studies back, there was something very similar and you named it differently, but actually this thing fits better. So maybe you'll even go back and rename some of these things retroactively so that it's standardized and so that we can easily see that it's the same relationship that was studied. So, but yes, at this stage, general topics, general variables, so that we can start grouping those studies by theme. And then once we know which themes have more studies in them, that's where we will go deeper in those specific sample. So we'll not disregard, but we will not need all the details about unique studies, but we'll eventually need a lot of details about studies that are in the same group.
Okay. Would you want me to insert another column which talks about the theme just beside topic?
It doesn't matter. I think topic in this case is enough. So with the theme, that's something we'll do later on once we have the full picture, because it's impossible to, like at this time, theme and topic seems about the same to us.
Yeah.
But later on, we will probably try to group them in a kind of in bigger categories, as I said, maybe attitudes versus behaviors versus performance or something like that. But it's hard to say until we know what the general topics are, so that, before we start grouping them into larger categories.
Sure, Professor. Yeah, I think it makes it easy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, then, yes. As I said, once you're done with the next several studies, maybe if needed, let's connect again and take another look. But that's the idea. And do not spend too much time, just like I showed in the example here. Probably 5-10 minutes at most per study at this stage will be enough, maybe even less.
Okay.
Once you recognize what it's about, once you recognize which 2 variables were correlated, or on which of the variables groups were compared, the differences were compared, that's all you need. So, and if they have like a correlation table, like we saw, just list all the variables and forget about the rest. And once you list all the variables, you'll know what the topics is as well. So,
sure, Professor. Yeah, I will do that. Yeah.
All right, sounds very good.
Yeah, I think that's all I have. Do you want me to give me a deadline?